What happens when you have your own personal Bay of Pigs? Well, today we're going to find out on the episode of the Tonic Accord podcast. My name is Drew, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Alex. Hello, Alex. How you doing, man?
Hey, Drew. I'm doing pretty well. Just booked my flight in a month to come back to California, so I'm bittersweet, but kind of excited to get home. How about you? How are you?
Hey, that's good, man. We're excited to have you back. I wonder how that flying is going to be. If it's going to, I'd be kind of sketched. I'll be honest. Masked up, gloved up.
Yeah, I mean, so I have to go through Charles de Gaulle in Paris. I need a special form that says I'm arriving through French territory for specific reasons. And then I have a 2-hour layover, which I'm a little worried, depending on security and the testing. It could be interesting. I'm a little nervous myself, but I think I'm going to be getting a antibody test actually in early June to get the paperwork. So if I do have antibodies or if I don't have coronavirus, at least I'll have a document to make things a little bit better.
Wow.
So
Nuts. Well, I hope you're able to travel safely.
Thanks, man.
We have a pretty interesting story today, that's for sure. Kind of something off the topic of this whole coronavirus, almost like completely out of nowhere. There's a report that a ex-Green Beret and his men tried to stage a coup against Venezuela's leader Maduro and ultimately failed. And now 2 Americans are in custody, I guess, of the Venezuelan government, imprisoned abroad, and people are just trying to make sense of what the hell just happened. And so let's dive into it. So first off, the main things that we need to get out there is this is not a U.S. action, right? This is not a U.S. military action. It's not sanctioned by the government. It was not planned and enacted by any military apparatus or agency. This is a private guy. It's a private contractor who made this his own decision to do this. So at first, when it was first happening, I remember hearing reports that Maduro said a U.S. CIA plot to overthrow him has been thwarted, and I was like, what? No, it's not a U.S. CIA plot. It's actually just a dude, just a dude and his gang, I guess. And we'll get into the exact details, but. Yeah, Alex, what have you heard? I mean, what was your initial reaction when you heard this story about a coup going on in Venezuela?
So first off, I can't tell if I should be just horrified that people were stupid enough to try to do this or laugh my way through this story because of how ridiculous it is. And it's probably a little bit of both. I know Maduro told Venezuela that these men were playing Rambo.
Yeah.
And I don't think you ever want to be described as playing Rambo, especially when I think there was 8 armed men were killed and these other 2 were taken.
Yeah.
So obviously they were outnumbered, which is the first thing I got out of this, which is, I mean, you don't need to have a large amount of troops, but as I recall, they also recorded video footage and tweeted about it leading up to this. Yeah, so it was very careless. And I heard Ben Rhodes on Pod Save the World / Obama National Security Advisor say that this makes the Bay of Pigs look like D-Day. And I think that's a pretty good analysis of this. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I'm just worried that it's going to make Maduro more paranoid and probably more dangerous and consolidate power. So that's kind of my big takeaway from this.
I mean, it was handing a political victory to Maduro on a silver platter. Because now he can say, I've thwarted a U.S. coup, when in reality it was a Mr. Wannabe, G.I. Joe. Now let's go into it. Who is this guy? Who's this wannabe Rambo? And it's actually interesting, this story. I was looking at, Vice has a really good part about where this guy comes from, and NBC News has a really good in-depth article, the mind-blowing story of the ex-Green Beret who tried to oust Venezuela's Maduro. And so that was really interesting to me, was this guy has a ton of military experience and yet kind of threw it out the window. So let's go back to the beginning. So this guy's named Jordan Goudreau. He was in the United States military in the 2000s. I think it was 2001 to 2016. He was U.S. Army as a Special Forces medical sergeant and indirect fire infantryman. So this guy obviously has military experience. I mean, he's not, he's not just a stay-at-home wannabe G.I. Joe. Like this guy is military. He was deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. He gained a reputation as a fearsome warrior with an expert shot. Like you hear this and you're like, wow, this guy actually sounds like pretty capable and talented as far as military stuff goes and combat but it's after his military service that he starts to get a little weird. After he left the military, he did security work in Puerto Rico for Hurricane Maria, but then the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting happened. So this is where the whole story of this private Silvercorp security firm comes in. So the shooting in Florida happened, and he says, this is his own words, I saw Parkland and I was like, well, no one's tackling this, so I want to fix this. So he created this like business plan that was like a Netflix idea of everyone paying a monthly fee to hire an undercover special forces agent in every school in the United States, which is crazy, right? Like that's, I mean, interesting idea, like certainly out of the box. I mean, and I understand his logic, right? He thinks that the cops at the Florida shooting didn't do enough, and they waited too long. So he's like, we need to get special forces in there. Well, his idea didn't really get off the ground. I mean, what do you think of that idea? Like, that's a pretty bold idea.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here. First off, yeah, I mean, it is an interesting idea, and like you said, I'll give him credit. It's definitely out of the box for sure.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back to the general idea is that this is kind of what happens with a lot of these private contractors, especially guys with military experience, is to me it sounds like they leave the service, but the service doesn't really leave them. Mm-hmm. And they keep kind of looking for ways to get involved. And unfortunately, a lot of these ways seem to supersede international law and kind of the status quo of how a military operation would be carried out.
Right. And
it sounds like, at least from the reports I'm getting from the Associated Press and The Nation, which I don't completely trust, but it kind of sounds like the Colombian government, or at least parts of the Colombian government, decided to subscribe to his Netflix company, basically. And I mean, it's interesting, and I do want to make it clear is that clearly they weren't acting alone, because there are reports that they were training a military unit in northern Colombia before this. So
yeah,
they were working with a government, and I mean it's really interesting. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that this seems to happen a lot with private contractors. Is they kind of start working in the shady parts of international affairs, and this just seems to be another one of those, but in a very creative way and a very sloppy way. And now I've heard reports, that Guaido, who is recognized by I think 50 nations as the leader of Venezuela, though let's be honest, he is not the leader of Venezuela. He doesn't have the military.
He doesn't have any power.
And so no, he does not. But there are reports that maybe Guaido was working with them as well, or at least had ideas to them, though he's denied that. But to me, this just sounds like a lot of finger pointing, and it's really hard to get information out of this. But at the end of the day, this Silvercorp is an interesting idea, and I agree with you that maybe the logic and the ethics could be there for, him feeling that the Parkland shooting didn't have enough help. But who authorizes this guy to make decisions like this that could jeopardize the United States?
That's exactly the point. So, yeah, I mean, like, let's go deeper into Silvercorp here, because there's a lot of misdirection and illegitimacy. So, yeah, he has this idea for the Parkland, like to combat school shooters. He wants to put, special forces in schools undercover. Interesting idea. Doesn't get off the ground. Then he tries to, because he's trying to still prop up his Silvercorp business, right? He there was other ex-Green Berets, a guy named Drew White, who was involved with the Parkland response thing, but not this coup. And he was like, yeah, I mean, Silvercorp's motto was protecting our most precious assets. To try and get it off the ground more, Goudreau posted videos of himself at a Trump rally in 2018, like with like a earpiece, looking very like security. But let's be clear, this is 2018. The president has the Secret Service. They're not hiring Silvercorp. So it's either this whole Trump rally thing. Because again, earlier in the story, a couple sources said the guys who did the coup are linked to Trump. No. Let's not go there. They're not linked to Trump. Trump had nothing to do with this. This guy posted one photo of him at a Trump rally in 2018 as a fake Secret Service agent. So either he was hired as security, probably by a contractor through the event location that was okayed by the Secret Service, that probably had no conversations with Trump himself, or two, he just faked looking like a Secret Service agent. Like, he's not hired by anyone there. He just attended the rally as a private citizen and just did this photo op to make Silvercorp look legit. Either way, Silvercorp is not tied to the Trump administration at all. It's just a private citizen in his security form. And so that's just really funny to me that he just went to this rally and tried to pose as a Secret Service agent. That post from Silvercorp on Instagram has since been deleted. And then here's where it gets interesting, because you mentioned that he was in Colombia and working with like locals in the area. He did do security at the Venezuela Live Aid concert outside of Venezuela that was run by Richard Branson to try and bring attention to the government in Venezuela. So like, he obviously cares about this, personally, and was involved. But then here's where it gets really sketchy. And again, that your point about how some of these private contractors start to operate in this gray area was, he had 60 Venezuelans that were upset with Maduro's government. He told them, yes, I'm a bodyguard for Donald Trump, and I have the backing of the U.S. Like, I have the backing of the United States. So then 60 people thought that this guy was a legit representation of U.S. force. And they were the ones that were like, all right, yeah, we'll get on board. And then 2 other Americans. And that's when it's like, this guy was actually lying to people. This guy was telling them that I was a bodyguard for Donald Trump. No way, no, not in hell. That's BS. And so he was leading people to believe that he had way more power and influence than he did. And they were basically leading them to their doom.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, he seems to me like a sociopath.
Yeah.
And someone that, like I said earlier, you can take him away from the service, but you can't take the service out of him. And it kind of sounds like a guy who's looking for a war. Yeah. Or maybe not a war, but for some heroic deed.
He wants to be a hero. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's the problem of this, is that Venezuela, like pretty much every other issue we've talked about in this entire show, is it's become politicized in the United States. And so it's really hard to actually talk about what happened here without some people wanting to point fingers at Trump, right? So I think it's very believable to a lot of people in the United States that Trump authorized this, because, he's been very openly against Maduro. He invited Guaido to his State of the Union, I think back earlier this year. And like, clearly Trump has made Guaido and his more center-right party a political movement. And unfortunately, the more progressive left has also supported keeping Maduro in power in some ways by saying we don't want to do a regime change. And so, unfortunately, it gets muddled, and it becomes believable that a guy like this would be working for Trump. But I think that's the problem, because like you said, there is no evidence that he is at all involved with Trump. And I saw that picture too that you sent the link to, and he looks like a crazy guy who took a selfie 20 feet from Trump and claims to be private security for him.
Yeah, like he has no badge. He has that little squiggly thing on his ear. Like, dude, this is 2018. Like, there's the real Secret Service at this place. Like,
oh, completely, man, completely. And I mean, New York Magazine, which is obviously pretty supportive of Trump, they highlight a good point in an article I was reading, where you don't really have to look too deep into history of Latin America to know that usually if the U.S. is involved, their coups are pretty successful. I mean, the United States has a pretty good yet unfortunate record of overthrowing left-wing governments in the Latin America region. And in quotes, the New York Magazine says, if you want to capture a country's capital city, you're going to need more than a boat, some guns, and 62 men of dubious military skills. And I mean, I think that's the truth of it. And it does worry me, because, last week we talked about Thucydides' trap, right? And I couldn't help but think of that actually during this, because now you have anger coming out of Russia and China about this, condemning the U.S. imperialists. And the problem is, it only takes one idiot doing something like this that could cause another domino effect in the region or amongst Venezuelan allies like Putin and Xi Jinping.
Right. And they're not going to care about the truth. Putin probably knows this has nothing to do with the U.S. military, but he's going to just,
of course,
they're going to use it to their advantage. And again, like you said about, usually the U.S. doesn't lose, or at least we do it a lot like differently. I mean, Bay of Pigs maybe not so much, but like
Right.
we certainly wouldn't tweet about it before, and so that's where this even gets more interesting. Is NBC talks about Goudreau tweeted about the mission late Sunday before as it was happening and tagged the president. He's tweeted strike force incursion into Venezuela, 60 Venezuelan, 2 American ex-Green Berets at real Donald Trump. What? Can you imagine if we tweeted out before we were attacking bin Laden, like strike force incursion into bin Laden's encampment, southern Pakistan, 12 Navy SEALs, 4 helicopters, going to be great at Barack Obama. Like
No, it's ridiculous. It'd be ridiculous.
this is almost like South Park satire to me of like
Yeah.
live tweeting your coup raid at the president. Like what?
Yeah, this is a South Park take on like an American imperialist attack.
Yeah.
Like this is what you would. Yeah, you're right.
Now and like I think it does hit home that point you made of like, you know. And it's a tough conversation, right? Because you do have these service members that are like, again, this guy was highly trained. He had 15 years of military service and had a reputation of being an excellent crack shot. You know, I mean, like an effective soldier. And I get that you have these guys that spend, a decade or more being trained in one thing, and then they're kind of thrown back into civilian life. And that I can only imagine, because again, not by experience, but I can only imagine that transition must be tough for some of these guys. I do get that, right? I understand that it's got to be a hard transition back into civilian life. But I think that this is evidence of a guy that couldn't do it, right? When you are out of the military, you are back to being a civilian. You're back into civilian life. And I understand that there's that whole famous saying, once a Marine, always a Marine. I get that. I understand that there's that brotherhood involved. But the reality is, the legal reality is, when you are now back into private citizen life, and it seems like this guy never could understand that or accept that, because this guy is obviously trying to play Navy SEAL, and when he's not, like, you're not a Green Beret anymore, man. You're a dude. You're a dude from Florida.
God. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, there's, always a Marine, and, you hear veterans talk about the culture and the values. And I think, like you said, that's what it means, is once you leave the service, it's a way of life, more the values and the brotherhood you got there, not acting outside of international law to do something like this. And, that brings me kind of to another point I want to ask you about on this is, clearly, over the last, I would say probably decade and a half or 2 decades, a majority of the conflicts in the Middle East and most of the world are mainly run by private security forces that work outside of, the black and white apparatus of military forces. And do you think that's a good thing, or do you think that's a bad thing?
I think it's a bad thing. And because this is part of the discussion that we could have a whole another episode on, is like the use of private security contractors in the Middle East and around the world in general. I think it's been a bad thing, because one is now, you have the United States military using forces that don't have to adhere to the military's rules of engagement, right? And they can kind of act in this gray area. And there has been a lot of controversial moments. I'm trying to remember the one where it's I think it's Blackwater.
Yeah,
Blackwater is one of the most notorious private security contractors. And then there was they were engaged in something called the Nusar Square Massacre in 2007. Blackwater Security Consulting, again a private security contracting firm, a private military company that was contracted by the United States government, killed 17 Iraqi civilians in a square in Baghdad.
Right.
This has led to, there's documentaries on both sides of whether this was a self-defense or this was a extrajudicial killing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation found that the 17 Iraqis were killed by this private security without cause, right? That's the FBI's standing. So this is just, obviously it's one example, right? But this is an example of how there's been use of these private security firms, and it's led to things that, make things worse. It's led to extrajudicial killings. It's led to things that are not good, right? It's led to conflicts and complications that have a bad stain on the U.S. use of these firms. So I think in general, right, if you're going to make the decision as a government to go to war, you do it in the most legitimate way through the use of your legitimate power set up by your constitution with the understanding and approval of your democratic populace. When I see these private military contracts being handed out, I see it as more of a business transaction to get away from oversight.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree with the sentiment there for sure. You know that it is a way to get outside of the oversight and just the international regulations and just human rights involved. But I have to say that I almost think it's become an inevitable part of kind of the 21st century of warfare, because I think the more and more we get away from the most, stereotypical boots on the ground war, we've gone to drones and more technology based attacks. And unfortunately, I think that we've started to have to find outside people to do the work that no one else wants to do anymore. And like, as I was reading something in the Atlantic that was out this week, and they actually were talking about this, and they said the reason why this began during Iraq is because the U.S. military is kind of in a gray area, where they don't want to enact another draft like in Vietnam. Not enough people were volunteering, and they couldn't rely on big surges of patriotism kind of towards that 2005, 2006 part, where
Right.
hope started to kind of decline.
Yeah.
And so they had to rely on the private sector. And I'm not at all defending it, but I think it's unfortunately become a very realistic reality. And like, I mean, even going further, because you mentioned Blackwater, and Eric Prince is the founder. He's Betsy DeVos's either brother or brother-in-law. I forget exactly, but he's definitely some form of a brother to her. And he is still working with a group called the Wagner Group, which is a Russian quasi-private contract firm that are basically helping fuel the civil war in Libya.
Yeah.
And like, so I think it's almost become what the world is becoming, unfortunately, because basically what's happening in the Middle East now is we kind of showed a lot of these people how to use the private sector and how to use extra military forces. And now the Syrian model is going into Libya, and basically the US and Russia are basically exploiting that, So
Yeah.
I think that's why, kind of putting this full circle back to this Venezuelan crisis, is that's why I think some people didn't find it hard to believe that Trump would authorize this, because on a day-to-day basis, this type of stuff is authorized in places like Libya.
Sure. I mean, again, like, I understand that, like, it does seem like that's the way the winds are going, and of course, like you mentioned, in the mid 2000s, that's a unique situation where the United States doesn't have the support from its usual military. People just weren't joining. But again, like, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to start to see the concerns when you when you make war a profitable business, right? Like,
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I can see how, if you don't have I can see how in 2006 it was okay. We need to fulfill a need with private security firms, but then look at what happened. A year later, 2007, you have a massacre of innocent civilians that probably set back all the things the United States military was trying to do in that area years, right? Because contrary to popular belief, the United States was actually trying to have a good relationship with the Iraqi people, and we failed. And private security firms certainly didn't help that. And then again, like I said before, like, if you make war as a profitable business, like, there's obviously going to be some ethical problems with that. So yeah, I mean, and you're definitely right. They're being used. This is not just the United States. This is absolutely being used by all over the world. Private military, paramilitary. I mean, the whole war in Ukraine right now is a war between two paramilitary forces. The Ukraine and Russia are not at war, but Ukrainian paramilitary and Russian paramilitary are certainly at war. It's all this weird gray area now, and it does kind of. I mean, you definitely hit the nail on the head, right? Because conventional warfare has gone out the window. I mean, not with 9/11, with drone warfare, with cyber warfare. The whole, like, all right, we're going to meet on a battlefield with our guys in uniforms versus your guys in uniforms. Like, that, it is kind of gone. You're definitely right that warfare is completely different now. And I just think that going down this route of private paramilitaries is just going to be is just going to lead to more and more of these ethical gray areas and more of this confusion, right? Like this is now Venezuela can say the U.S. had a failed coup. No, we didn't. This guy and his buddies went down there and they thought they could try something that they obviously couldn't. It had nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy. It's just we're going down a dark road with these private paramilitaries, and this is the goofiest and dumbest example of where it can lead.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. And I mean, I think you're right that it gets complicated and dark and confusing. I mean, because I mentioned that Wagner group earlier, and Eric Prince, who is the Blackwater founder, and so they're technically not called Blackwater anymore. Blackwater legally doesn't exist anymore, but they basically still exist, right? And but it's interesting because this Wagner group is actually the one that Eric Prince was helping with the war in Ukraine. And the Russians use them because they're a low-cost, low-risk instrument to the Russian military. And that's the problem is Foreign Policy magazine said that the U.S. troops are killing Wagner fighters in Syria and in Libya because we're on different sides of a conflict. And that's a problem because we have an American private company helping fund a Russian-supported company that we're killing in another country. It just gets so convoluted that eventually there's going to have to be accountability, and I think like you said, that's the problem is these circumvent Congress and accountability. And I mean, there's been Senate reports. I think there was one, if I recall, called like Warlord Inc. in 2010 that found that the U.S. was hiring warlords for security services.
Right.
The British military was contracting Afghan generals who were linked to murder, kidnapping, and bribery. It's excuse me, but it's just the damn SH show,
Yeah.
And eventually it's not good. But I mean, most people think in the future, 80 to 90% of ground troops will be private contractors because you have to fill that void, because even in the times of technology, cyber warfare, drones, there still has to be some boots on the ground for the hard stuff,
Sure.
And I don't think many Americans want to be caught in the fire of drones. So you have to find someone. It's a harsh reality. But the Venezuelan thing, that's just a whole other thing, because like we've talked about, all it does is just makes us look bad as the United States. And it makes Maduro quite paranoid and probably just helps his regime.
Yeah, it helps him solidify more power, and it helps his image, right? He can tell his whole propaganda machine, look at how powerful we are. We stopped a U.S. coup. Not even the big imperial U.S. capitalist dogs can take us down. Like, the propaganda is going to go to town with this. And here's the real sad part. And the real sad part is now we have 2 Americans that are in prison. And guess what? The guy who led this, Goudreau, was not there. He didn't lead his men. In fact, he was recording a video about it. He was recording a video of, I have men moving in right now in the coup. Well, as he was recording that video, his men were actually getting captured and 8 of them getting killed. And so now you have this position where the guy, the moron that led this is still free. I mean, he's in hiding. He's not giving interviews. And apparently the Associated Press is reporting that he's, in fact, maybe being investigated by the U.S. for possible arms trafficking. But he's still out there. Yeah, Goudreau's still out there. And his 2 buddies, the 2 Americans that are ex-Green Berets that are also a part of this, they're the ones imprisoned in Venezuela. Some have called for Goudreau to exchange himself for those other 2 because it was his idea in the first place. They've called for him like, yo, man, like, this was your plot. You were the leader. I don't know why you weren't on the ground anyway. If you wanted to be the hero, you should have been there. They're saying that he should now switch out for the other 2. I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that? I think it'd be a noble thing to do. I don't think he's going to do it. But I mean, really, like, his decisions led to 2 Americans being imprisoned.
No, I mean, it would be the right thing to do, but clearly we've seen this guy does not do what's right.
No,
I mean, I think that's thrown out, but that those guys. I mean, to me, I feel like there's one or 2 scenarios. These guys rot in a Venezuelan prison, or Maduro demands a lot in return for them.
Yeah,
and it's an unfortunate reality because we have to protect our own, and I just worry what Venezuela would want in return. And it puts us in such a bad situation when I mean, the reality is that Venezuela is a country that needs help.
Yeah.
And I completely support Maduro going, but I think as we've seen, it needs to happen organically. I mean, the West tried to prop up Guaido, and he's recognized by 50 countries, and he still obviously has no clout. And it needs to happen organically. But I mean, I just remember always learning in political science and international affairs that you only lose power once you lose the military, and unfortunately, he still has the military.
Right.
So I just don't think there's a good outcome. I mean, I could see these two rotting in jail at least for a long, decent period of time, because that Maduro is going to want a lot, and I don't see Trump budging.
Yeah. So I mean that I see that too. I mean, I really don't see any reason why the Venezuelan government would have shown any mercy, or what I mean? Like they have all the leverage, right? The Venezuelan government has all the leverage. They have the PR win. They have 2 Americans in custody. They won. They won everything about this scenario. And the United States was now unfortunately dragged into this stupid mess for no fault of its own, right? Again, this is not planned by the U.S. at all. This is not a Bay of Pigs, because the buck does not stop with the president. This is just some dude from Florida. Amazing. It's amazing, but an amazing story in the truest sense of, like, I'm amazed. Not in a good way. But certainly a little bit funny, but also a little bit sad.
Yeah. No, I agree completely, and I'm really curious to see what role Colombia had in this, because I mean, when I was researching stuff for this podcast, there's not a lot of great sources that go into too much detail on what's really happened, because no one really knows, and I mean, it's clear that the Colombian government is not a fan of the Maduro administration, or regime. Sorry, administration is a nice word, but so I'm curious what's next between the relations between these two hateful neighbors.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, again, it's like it could also have been they might have been misled, right? Colombia might have thought, hey, we're doing something like, oh, there's a U.S. backed Delta Force guy, like this is a good contact to have. Maybe we can make something happen. And then they find out, oh no, this guy has no actual sway in the U.S. government whatsoever. That's the thing is, he could have been misleading everybody, right? The Venezuelans he was leading, the Americans he was leading, the Colombians he was possibly working with. Like, I think he was just lying to people. And so that's what's the big shame is, I mean, especially the men that lost their lives, right? 7 or 8 men, I think are reported have been killed. I think from what we know, those were the Venezuelans that wanted to rise up against Maduro. These guys were lied to. They thought they were about to start a revolution to free their country, and in reality, they were walking into their deaths.
Yeah. There's really nothing too good out of it, and I mean, like, all jokes aside, that's just where I feel bad. I feel bad for the Venezuelans, and
yeah, absolutely.
I think that they deserve better from both their potential allies like us and from the regime.
Of course, certainly. Well, certainly one of the strangest stories we've covered on the Tonic Accords. Again, something that really does seem like it's out of South Park. Thank you for listening, everyone. Be sure to catch up on our upcoming episodes. We're going to be talking about herd immunity and what some other countries are doing in reaction to the coronavirus. Please stay tuned and check us out on YouTube, Podbean, Facebook, Instagram, the whole 9 yards. Anything else you want to say, Alex, before we head out?
No, you covered it. We good.
All right. Take care, folks. Thank you again.